Welcome to the Golden Shadow. My name is Alyssa Platesy.
And I'm Arran Rogerson.
And today we're discussing the Wheel of Fortune, a mysterious and complex tarot card that captures the archetypal dynamics of fate, free will, and personal agency. So we're really going to use this card, the Wheel of Fortune, as a launching pad into a deeper philosophical discussion around these concepts. So let's start by defining them a little bit. What do you think, Arran?
So fate, destiny, free will, these are all concepts exploring the same kind of idea. How much agency do you have over your life? How much control have you had over the events that have transpired in your life? The events that will transpire, wherever you find yourself at this current moment? How much of it did you decide upon, and how much of it just sort of happened to you? And this is present in our lives all the time, this sort of notion of we wake up in the morning and we often sort of ask ourselves, how did I get here? Or what's happening to me? Or how did everything fall apart? How did I end up in this place? Maybe you take a strange move and you move to a different state and you're sort of like, wow, how did I end up in Oklahoma? Like I was never expecting that. Or you change jobs and you find yourself working a job that you never thought you'd be working. And maybe it's great. And you're just like, I never ever thought that I would be working in a garden as a groundskeeper with a rake, and I thought I was going to be some sort of like pop star, but here I am working out in the wilderness, and I'm much happier this way, and I just never expected this to happen to me. And so we're all sort of taking these strange paths through life, and we sort of trick ourselves often into thinking we have complete agency over what happens to us. Everything that happens, we have decided. We can take credit for all the good things, and yet all the bad things that happen to us, those aren't our fault. That was fate. I'm not to blame for this bad thing that happened to me. I'm not to blame for something else that happened to someone else. And so we're constantly kind of juggling these ideas. Are you responsible for your actions, or are you not? Our justice system is even like kind of based upon this idea that people have responsibility over their actions. And if for some reason they are not responsible, as if like they're crazy, let's say someone is insane, suddenly they don't have agency, and therefore they cannot be punished in the way that you would normally punish someone. So there's all these ideas of like, how much agency do we have, what's within our control, and what's out of our control.
Yeah. Well, the Wheel of Fortune's interesting because it starts to really amplify this idea or introduce it into the psyche in a way that pulls you out of the bubble of believing that you have control or believing that free will is the only aspect that's at play here. Everything that I can control, all these things that happen come from my own hand. And within the major arcana, when this card comes up, it's a really big shift in tone. All of the sort of subsequent cards that come after this are really just sort of turning this idea of what life is on its head. And this is like the starting point. It is like the shifting of the major arcana. And so when this comes up for us in everyday life, it's when we start to grapple with this idea of destiny, of fate, of things that are out of our control. And maybe up until these points, we're kind of living in a sense of illusion, or maybe just in a naivety. And at a certain point, reality or these universal dynamics come crashing into us. And that might be something in the form of, going outside and going about your day as normal, and then getting into an accident, and how that shifts and changes your life in ways that you couldn't have foreseen. And it's like, why did this happen? It's
Right.
like, well, it's Wheel of Fortune, right?
Right. It's like a very cosmic card.
Yes, very
as you're
cosmic.
saying, that a lot of the cards in the tarot deck, there's 78 cards, and they have varying degrees of heaviness almost, or
Sure.
varying degrees of scope.
Mm-hmm.
Or a lot of cards feel very zoomed in.
Sure.
And might say, well, this is like a pretty simple card. This is sort of about like daily life. And then like Wheel of Fortune is a card that represents sort of this idea of like cosmic act of God, Deus
Mm-hmm.
Ex Machina,
Yeah, definitely.
the patterns of the universe that are like pushing and pulling at you,
Yeah.
and you are just a ant in a huge ocean, and you are just like a pawn in like the wheels of
Yeah.
fate, and so a very cosmic card.
Yeah, it is the recognition of these outside forces, and that is something that is incredibly destabilizing for people. When you realize that you are at the mercy of something else, something that you cannot control. But this is really something that we've been grappling with as humans for forever.
Forever. I mean, since before history, I think this is something that people
Yeah.
are sort of tossing around is like, why do bad things happen to
Right.
us?
Yeah.
Why do good things happen? And do we have any influence? Can we do a kind of sacred dance to make it rain?
Yeah.
Do we have any control over the rain?
Yeah.
Maybe we do. Let's find out. Or no, you have no control over the rain, and there's a drought. Nothing you can do about it.
Yeah.
And I think humans struggle with both of those ideas.
Certainly.
Do I have power here? Whew, that's a lot of responsibility. Do I have no power at all? That's really frustrating.
Yeah.
So I think this is a question that's as old as consciousness.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that, for those of us kind of caught in the grip of ego consciousness, that we don't want to recognize and let go of that sense of power and control and agency. And the Wheel of Fortune comes in and just kind of like smacks that aside and says, I do not care. I will show you. I will put you in your place. So it relativizes, the ego or whatever tendency we have to believe that, the scope of possibility is everything that we can, put our eye on, or as something that we can even envision. It's like the Wheel of Fortune comes in and says, there's no way you saw this coming. And that can be really positive. It can be really great too. Something amazing has happened. I got this opportunity that when you look back 5 years later, has completely changed your life in this powerful way. So it's just feeling gripped in something that is greater than yourself.
Right.
And
So when you draw the card, when you are doing a spread, if you are someone who uses tarot as a practice, this card, it'll land on top of a few other cards perhaps. Or maybe you're only drawing one card and you draw Wheel of Fortune. But there is this feeling when you draw that card that's sort of like a reminder
yeah.
that there's things at play that you do not understand, or there's things happening to you that you don't have any control in. And you have to remember to be at peace in some regard with the way in which things are happening to you.
Yeah.
You need to learn to sit with the feeling of no control.
Yeah, uncertainty.
Uncertainty. You need to learn to sit with the fact that something has happened to you and it's not fair. It's really not fair what's happened to you. But this whole idea of fairness is something that's like, well, nature, the universe, in some sense, God, with some people's interpretation, like it's not just fair. It's not just like good things happen to good people.
Right, because it's amoral,
Right.
These things are just going to happen. And the way
Right.
that they affect you, it's like, yeah, it could be good. Yeah, it could be bad. But like, there's no true judgment really coming from the universal force. And I think about kind of meaningful ways that this card has shown up for me or other people that I've read for. And I drew this card at a time where things were really chaotic in my life and feeling very just pulled in all these directions with no sense of grounding, and a lot of things happening that I wish I could control, and feeling really bad about it. And I remember just drawing the card and immediately getting so emotional, which isn't hard for me,
Yeah.
but just what I saw reflected in that card was just this feeling of, okay, like you can remember that a lot of what's happening is part of the greater forces that are at play, and you can let go of that feeling of needing to know, what is the next turn, and are we going to go uphill or are we going to go downhill, or am I going to get spit out or am I going to get trampled? It just kind of felt like, in this moment, at least, that I could be reminded of that. And some of that heaviness and some of that tension just felt release. And, not in the way that it makes me like just give up all personal responsibility. That's
Right.
not what the card does. If anything, it tries to show you the tension between that sort of personal responsibility and agency and control, along with all of those forces that you can't. And and just recognizing it in those moments. And so for me, it was really powerful just to have that reminder and to feel like I could sit with where things were presently and lean into it and allow things to develop and in some ways kind of just trust in it, trust myself kind of caught in the grip of the wheel and see where it was going to spit me out next.
Right. So one of the ways the evidence at least is that this has been talked about for a very, very long time is in our mythology.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
one of the most well-known mythologies of this notion of cosmic justice or why do good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people is the book of Job in the Bible. And this is like, super well-known, super analyzed story. But this idea that Job has done everything right and he's good and he serves God well.
Yeah.
And yet all these bad things happen to him. And despite all these bad things happening to him, he doesn't really lose faith. And it is tapping into this idea of the life outcomes of everyone. They sort of vary in these ways that don't often make sense to us. And there is this notion of like, well, he did everything right and he still failed. Or this person really doesn't deserve this. Why are they the one who is receiving these accolades, or why are they inheriting all this money, or why did this person survive while this person died in this situation, things like that. And this really, I mean, we could get into we'll probably have another episode at some point in which we talk about God or what God is and just what God has been in mythology and how can we like sort of reconcile that with the way that we see the world now. But there is this notion that God is doing things. He's intervening in people's life. He's laying down judgment in ways that doesn't seem to hold up to what our logic would tell us. And yet you're supposed to like maintain your faith. You're supposed to keep trying to do things the right way. You should keep adhering to some sort of moral code. You should not give up hope. You should not just say, well, okay, well, nothing matters. I have no control over my life. The point is like, no, bad things will still happen to you occasionally, no matter what.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that everything is meaningless, and it doesn't mean that you actually have no control. There's actually this balance here.
Well, there's also kind of the question of like, what is the greater lesson that's being taught, or what does the individual gain through these challenges, kind of going into like the crucible and being shaped by these hot, difficult fires. They're being poked and prodded and suffering in all these ways. And it shapes character and individuality in a way that it can be very, very powerful when we're willing to sort of meet the uncertainty and have a level of faith or trust in it to some degree and kind of weather the storm, and kind of where do we come out on the other side of that. We can't ever truly make sense of God's will or a universal principle or this just chance happening, however you want to look at it, but that doesn't shift how it integrates into your own experience or how it challenges you to tap into some part of yourself that you didn't know was there. And maybe you are wounded in some way afterwards, but there's often some kind of deeper essence that's also taking shape through these experiences.
Right. So something that is really prevalent in human psychology and in the way that people deal with conflict and the way that they interpret the things that happen to them is we tend to think that someone is to blame for everything that happens. Always. We play the blame game very readily.
Yeah.
And you can see this very present in our current climate of just blame. Who's the bad person here? Or who are the evil people who are responsible for what has happened to me? Who are the people that we should hold as responsible as the scapegoat, and then we can execute them and pretend that like we've solved the problem because we've figured out what went wrong. It's this person's fault. And we tend to do this as a society. We tend to find some sort of group and say, well, they're the ones responsible for what's going on here. They messed everything up. This bad event that happened, it was their fault. And you can see this over and over again. And this has been a tool that people can capitalize on to galvanize a movement, as Hitler did, I would say. A lot of the communist movements also are just sort of capitalizing on this idea of blaming people for like, the reason your life is not what it should be is because of this one group that oppresses you.
Yeah.
But we do it in our relationships too. It's like if there's something wrong in our relationship, we tend to think, well, it must be your fault. Or maybe it's all my fault, but someone's to blame for what's gone wrong here.
Right.
And that only makes sense if you are under the opinion that everyone has complete agency over everything that's happening in their life.
Right.
And we find that this is actually not really true, that all kinds of things are happening all the time, that it's not really clear who's responsible. And it's easy to think, well, we can trace it back and find who's responsible.
Yeah.
But often we can't. We can't really make sense of like, how did all this happen? How did I get here? Who's responsible? Am I responsible or are you responsible? But if we examine it more closely, we find that like it's very hard to pinpoint who's responsible.
Well, you
many
can kind of
situations.
like really sort of peel back the layers, and you can start at like level one, which is like, this is me and you, and this is what you said, and this is what I said. It's like, okay, peel back the layer. It's like, why do you have a tendency to resort to this behavior? Well, that's because of this. It's like, okay, peel back another layer. Well, that's because in my childhood, I always resorted to, relating to people like this. And like, okay, why is that? Because my parent was like this. And why are they like that? It's like, oh my God, you start to see this like unfolding, like fractal, like relational pattern where it's like all of these things were sort of fated to be where you ended up in life, who your parents are, the people that you met. It's like all of these things kind of coming into a type of synergy, which has led you to this very moment. And in some ways, like you're dealing with that fate of your own life and somebody else's, in addition to whatever like realistic facts you're actually trying to argue over.
Right.
So sometimes you just have to step back and like use that as an opportunity to just have perspective and just be maybe a little bit more understanding of the greater forces that are really at play.
Right. So, there's this question of like, can you really blame someone for their traumatic childhood? It's like, why is this person really unreliable? And it's like, well, they kind of have like a drinking problem.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, who's responsible for that? It's like, well, they had a really, really bad relationship recently and that ended horribly. And that's why they're drinking so much. And it's like, oh, well, who's responsible for that? It's like, well, the person that this alcoholic was dating was traumatized as a child and seems to have strange intimacy problems. And it's like, oh, okay, well, who's responsible for that? And it's like, well, the father was like very neglectful and maybe was verbally abusive towards her. And, that's why she's so traumatized. It's like, well, who's responsible for the father being abusive? It's like, well, his father was and you keep peeling this back. And the problem, first of all, if you just sort of do this one-to-one of like, what's the reason for this? Even that starts to illustrate of like, okay, so the reason that Phil is late is because of his ex-girlfriend Susan's father's father. That's why he's late. And like you realize it's like, that's absurd. That doesn't make any sense. There's no way you can say that like that's the reason he was late to the party.
Right.
And yet there is something there that's kind of like, well, that is partially why he was late to the party is because this strange thing that's traced back into the past, hundreds of years maybe.
Yeah.
And you keep going back and back and back, and then you sort of start to get into this like weird cause and effect thing.
Yeah.
Where it's like, well, the reason this happened is because of this, which is because of this, it's because of this. And the more you trace that back, the more you kind of understand. It's like, it's almost like people aren't really responsible for their own actions.
Yeah.
And that's what's strange. And, maybe someone has resorted to criminality to survive.
Right.
Maybe someone's a thief. And maybe they go around and they steal things. And it's easy to say, well, it's his fault. He's a thief and he should be punished for it. It's like, yeah, but isn't he only a thief because of the economic situation that's required him to somehow find a way to support himself because he can't get a job? It's like, okay, well, whose fault is that? Well, it's like, well, it's obviously the Republicans. And it's like, well, okay, wait, what? So it's like, it's their fault that he stole this sandwich. And it's like, again, like that doesn't really make sense either. It's like every time you trace this stuff back, the more and more you kind of realize that there's a lack of agency in a lot of people's actions.
Yeah, yeah.
And when you do that, the more compassion you have for everyone as being like, if no one's really in control completely, it's almost as if like we shouldn't punish them so hard for when they screw up.
Yeah.
And you start to feel that for more and more people. It's like, oh.
Yeah.
you're only doing this because of this,
Yeah.
and therefore it's not exactly your fault, and therefore I should feel compassionate towards you, because it's almost like you're caught in some sort of cause and effect loop
Yeah.
that you never chose to be in. You never chose to be traumatized as a child. Therefore, you should not be blamed for being traumatized.
Right.
And you get into this sort of gray confusion, which is really important to make sense of the world.
Well, it's interesting because I think part of the Wheel of Fortune as a card and as an entry point into this archetypal dynamic is that through this symbol, we gain greater perspective because we're able to step outside of ourselves and see things in this different way. And it does sort of invite in more of that grayness, as you're talking about. We recognize things aren't so black and white, and it certainly doesn't mean that we need to treat all situations and individuals in a way that is absolving them of responsibility and taking control. But like that's where like the tension of the opposites comes in, where you have to recognize that there is greater forces at play, things that you cannot control, the way that your life was destined to be, the gods and their choice of fate. In addition, you do have personal control. There is a level of agency. And how do you dance between the two of those? How do you extend compassion when you recognize that someone's fate is playing out while also maybe emboldening them and encouraging them to step into their power so that they can in some ways sort of like manipulate some of those patterns that were caused? Because fate might deal us a hand, but what we do with it is what's truly in our control.
Right. And so this is, there will be some philosophical qualms with this discussion, because free will, like, it really is like a complicated topic, and there is sort of, some people do have the notion that there actually is no free will at all, and that everything is cause and effect, and that the idea that we have control at all is actually an illusion. I don't really believe that. It doesn't really seem workable. It doesn't really seem like it's tenable as far as the way that we interact with reality, and it just becomes incoherent very quickly. But so within this sort of understanding that there's so much at play that we don't have control over, that you didn't choose your parents, you didn't choose to be born where you were born, you didn't choose your genes that you have. You didn't really choose anything probably until you were about, maybe age 12, 13. You didn't choose where you went to school. You didn't choose the people that you were exposed to in school.
Yeah.
You didn't choose the opportunities that were given to you as a child. There's so much chance just in who you are,
Yeah.
what you became. And we have to acknowledge that when we understand people's struggles. It's like, maybe you didn't really have much choice over where you are right now. Maybe you just did the best you could. But at the same time, as you're saying, we have to understand that there is truth to the idea that you do have power.
Yeah.
And we talk this way. And the idea of not talking this way is incoherent. Like the idea that if I'm like, if there is a mess on the ground, I have the power to clean the mess. It's like the idea of like, no, I don't. It will or it will not get cleaned. There is no decision to be made. It's like, well, that doesn't make sense. Like, no, I have the power to clean up the mess. I just need to get a broom and do it. And then when we're talking to each other, there's certainly language that we use. There's perception. There's a psychology that we have that us talking has some sort of point. It's not just like, well, there's no point communicating because we don't actually have any free will. So if we want to kind of coordinate how to go and get groceries, there's actually no point in coordinating because whether or not we get groceries is completely up to chance.
Yeah.
It's like, well, that doesn't really make any sense either.
Right.
Obviously, you have some power to communicate and figure out what to do in the situation. And that's what we have to sort of reckon with, is what does it mean to have agency?
Right.
And how much agency do you actually have? And this can get pretty confusing. We've already talked about in the podcast how much the ego is convinced that it has agency.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? The ego is like, I'm totally in control and I make all the decisions and I'm the one driving.
Yeah.
And as we've said repeatedly, it's like the reality is that the unconscious is more accurately the person who is driving, more accurately the part of you that's driving, and the ego is sort of in service to the unconscious. So there's already this idea just with human psychology, just with our notion of what's real and who am I, that is lacking in agency.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so difficult to reckon with.
Well, I mean, to that point, as we recognize that our own psychology and our own human dynamic has this principle of an unconscious element that is made up of, experiences that we've kind of tossed to the side, or, things that have been picked up in the environment, aspects that are building inside of us that have yet to bubble into consciousness. There's the recognition that we can come into relationship with it, and that ego consciousness plays a role as that, very sort of grounded principle that sort of gives us that continuity and that sense of I, and makes us feel like we have the power and agency, and we can keep that, and the structure of that can be sound, while also recognizing that there's a part of us that we don't fully understand, and that, at times when we take certain actions or behaviors, or we're doing something compulsively and we don't understand why, that we're living out what might be considered like a type of fate or destiny, because it feels like it's out of our control, but really, like, there's something deeper that's at play here, and maybe that's, I don't know, sort of part of the manifestation of all of the mythology of where this comes from, because we see, the gods at play in all of these stories kind of shifting the tides and coming in like a deus ex machina, or suddenly favoring this hero or not that one. There's this really like capricious natures that they have. It's like suddenly you're favored, and another time you're not. And, you can be accountable for your actions, but in some ways you can't, because what is the mood of the gods? And that spinning of the wheel is part of what our everyday experience is really like. And that plays into the nature of our unconscious, that if we don't recognize that this is at play, we will be destined to possibly live out patterns of fate that do not serve us. But as we see it for what it is, and know that maybe we can't control it completely, but can understand it more and integrate it and come into relationship with it, a new kind of harmony, a new kind of balance really is struck between the dynamics that you'll never truly be able to control, but can at least recognize are there, as well as the actions that you're taking.
Right. So a lot of the talk that people have, a lot of the language that's used just around self-help and self-improvement is essentially geared towards agency. And when we're talking about this balance between understanding what you have control over and what you don't have control over, a lot of the notion of wisdom, or the notion of becoming the person that you're meant to be, or getting someplace that you're meant to go in life, a lot of that is aiming at moving things increasingly in the direction of having control. The movement of the dial of like zero control or absolute control. It's like, well, it's somewhere in the middle. It's like, but can we move it closer and closer towards absolute control and further away from having no control? And I mean, we readily recognize this with money, right? If you have money, you have a lot of agency. You can do a lot of things. You have a lot of options. If there's some sort of disaster or storm that comes, or flood that comes and washes things away, it's like, if you have money, you'll be okay. You'll maintain your agency. And as you run out of money, and someone who is lacking money, we do recognize this as like a lack of agency. It's like your options run out. You have less and less things that you have control over. You're forced increasingly into a narrow box when you run out of money. And it's like, what can you do now? It's like, well, you might only have one option, which is to take this really bad job you don't want. Whereas if you're independently wealthy, you have all these options. And I think that's, I mean, money is a pretty basic example, but like when we're talking about wisdom and self-improvement, and like even the point of this podcast, the whole idea of integrating the shadow, a lot of that has to do with like moving the dial towards agency, not letting the shadow control you, not letting your life descend into the same bad habits, the same bad spirals over and over and over again. And that's what a lot of these practices are about.
Yeah, it's also sort of interesting because, like, as we strengthen ego, as we make it more resilient, as we make it more flexible and okay with knowing that these other pieces are at play, it allows you to feel comfortable with the lack of control, or times when you can sort of release it. And maybe that's partly how ego has been up until that point, like gripping and holding on in a way that's just like really like just totally off base,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe it's been an ego that's just not holding on at all.
Yeah.
Wherever you are on that spectrum of possibility, ultimately self-development, self-inquiry, inner work, all that kind of stuff helps you recognize who you are and your place in the world, and everything that's shaped you up until this point, and that allows you to be in these moments when the wheel comes and it grips
Mm-hmm.
you and it takes you in its grasp and spins you all around, where you can say, like, I know I can weather this, or I know that I will make it through, or I can turn back to certain aspects of myself that I can ground into and that I can control. And it's not control in a way that's erratic. It can be a very powerful grounding practice. You might not be able to control that you've had an onset of anxiety and depression that's hit you. It seems to have just come from nowhere. But how do you kind of root yourself through that? I turn to what I can control, which is taking care of myself physically, making sure
Right.
I eat well, exercise, get enough sleep, that I meditate, that I spend time with people
Mm-hmm.
who support me, that I get out into nature. These are like good ways of exercising control, of
Yeah.
feeling like you can hold on to something, even though you're in like the eye of the storm, even though everything around you feels like total chaos. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's what's so powerful sometimes about recognizing these universal forces, is that something has come in, the weather has changed, things are getting dark, a little bit scary, but you can hold on to your sense of self in a way that's, I don't know, you're not losing control.
Yeah.
And you're also not trying to control things in a way that it just doesn't really actually do any good for you.
Right. So, a personal anecdote to kind of try and like illustrate this concept is, and I'm not sure if I've talked about this on the podcast before. I don't think I have, but I used to work in an old folks home that we've talked about. I'm sure we talked about during the
In the
dreams
dream series, yeah.
episode. That, like, I was dreaming about being back at the old folks home. But one of the reasons that I stopped working at the old folks home was because I got a job doing something else, which was bartending. And bartending changed my life, which sounds kind of strange, because people kind of look down on bartending as a job sometimes. But if you bartend in the San Francisco Bay Area, in downtown San Francisco especially, you can make a lot of money. But there were two old folks homes. I worked at one, and then I randomly was asked to cover at the other old folks home, which I'd never done before, and that almost never happens. But they had me go over there to do some exercise stuff with the old folks, which is what I was doing at the old folks home. It was exercise stuff. But while I was covering this shift that was only going to happen one time, I had a random chance encounter with someone that I hadn't seen in a very, very long time, who also worked at the old folks home, who worked at the other one. And we just had a conversation. And then he was mentioning that he had been working at a bar as sort of a side thing, and that it just so happened that they were looking for a new bar back at the bar. And he just like threw it out there. He's like, do you want a bar back at this bar? And like, it seemed like such a strange idea, but something occurred to me. It was kind of like, huh. And I was like, I feel like I've heard that like some bartenders make a lot of money. And I just like had this inclination. It was kind of like, maybe this is a good idea. And I just decided to go for it. And it was such a random chance thing. And there's so many ways that it could not have happened. There's ways in which I could have not been working at the old folks home anymore. There's ways in which I could have not overlapped with this guy as far as the shift goes. I could have turned down the shift to cover. He could have been sick that day.
Yeah.
He could have just not brought it up in conversation. There's all kinds of things that could have happened that would not lead to this. But I took the job as a bar back. I started working at the bar, and I saw the potential, just observing about what was going on there and the way that people were making cash every night to get paid. And within 6 months, I was bartending, and I had essentially tripled my income in 6 months.
Yeah.
And I thought that was insane.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God. Like, and also just as a job, it just like felt so much better and more like there was so much more autonomy. There was so much more feeling of being an adult. And it was just in a matter of 6 months, my life had radically changed. And I had illustrated all these important things to myself about the ability to make money and support yourself in this serious way. That was like, oh, how did this even happen to me?
Yeah.
And it's easy to think, well, it's like, well, I made it happen. I just like, I figured it out, and I decided to do this thing, and I knew it would work out. And like, there's some truth to that. It has to be
Sure,
recognized that
yes.
like this wasn't just completely out of my hands. It's like I
Right.
did decide to take on this opportunity. I did decide to pursue it. I did decide to work really hard, but it was complete chance. Just like out of the blue.
Yeah.
And the forces of nature, the forces in the universe, these patterns, these ripples are just breaking through each other,
Right.
and they're forcing you in random directions, and who knows where you're going to end up, and you're just
Yeah.
like this little boat paddling in a big ocean, and the waves push you in certain directions, and you can paddle, but like ultimately it's like you're not in charge of the ocean.
Yeah.
You don't know where you're going.
Yeah.
And sometimes you just get spit out into a better place.
Yeah.
Or you get spit out into a worse place.
Yeah. And I think that's where like the interesting sort of personification of the Wheel of Fortune comes in, because we often see it as by the god's hand that the wheel spins. There's very like classical medieval imagery, specifically if you look up like the Wheel of Fortune,
Yeah.
where you see the goddess Fortuna sort of spinning the wheel, and by her hand, you know, an individual is being tossed on, and they might kind of land at the bottom of it and are kind of stuck, or they might, you know, be emerging and ascending to the top and kind of, you know, being graced with something. There's this
Right.
feeling that what is coming, what is happening to us, what is developing is powerful and shapes us and shifts us along this tide and then that, and then caught up in this current, but we're not in control. And yet in some ways, you know, if you're the little boat, there's some dynamic of the tension that you have as you're
Right.
paddling through it.
Yeah.
You know, it's like you needed to take that job, or you
Yeah.
needed to listen to something inside of yourself
Yeah.
that was like, Arran, give it a try. You could have said no. You could have stayed in a place
have.
that felt safe and the known, you know,
Yeah.
in the castle walls, not venturing out and taking the heroic leap into something kind of like weird, like
Right.
bartending, but like it radicalized your life in a really powerful way.
Yeah, certainly. And this is something else we've covered in previous episodes, but like certainly there's something to be said for placing yourself in a position where luck will find you.
Ooh, yes.
Right. So, I mean, the opportunity to work at this bar, for instance, is
Yeah.
like, was it totally out of your control? Or like, are you regularly putting yourself in a position to accept opportunities? And it's like, it seems lucky,
Yeah.
but in some sense, you're creating your own luck.
Yeah.
And like, did you have the instinct to know this is a good thing to try? And it's like, how are you doing that? So there's like, there is this interaction with like luck and like agency.
Yes.
And it's like, which one
Yes.
is it? It's like,
Yes.
it's both.
Yes, it's both.
And you can make yourself seem luckier by giving yourself more agency,
Yeah.
by opening yourself up to opportunity.
Yes. Yes. I've also sort of like mused lately to myself, do like certain personality types have a tendency towards being at least perceived as like more lucky than others. As an
Yeah.
example, like as a pretty strong like intuitive type, like I'm just oriented to like projecting possibilities
Yeah.
in the environment. And I think that makes me inherently sort of just
Yeah.
open to seeking, open to things that are kind of coming towards my door, even if it doesn't seem realistic or practical. It's like, yes, I will put myself out there in this way.
Yeah.
And so when you have that tendency, because I can even look back at my own life and feel like, man, I've been really lucky, or like, man, these things have just come. But in some ways, it's been a tension of me pushing or seeking or having some element where the door is open. It's
Right.
not closed shut. There isn't a tightness and and like walls that have been built up. It's like, no, I'm always kind of there's some sort of aspect of myself that's always, you know, got like the binoculars out and sort of seeking
Right.
and looking. And I think that is an aspect that does create luck, because you're willing to sort of take the leap on something that might not really make sense, or at least just perceive in the environment that something could be. And it's like, wow, that was really lucky that it happened. It's like, was it? I don't know. I just kind of, I went for it.
Yeah, I mean, going back to this ocean metaphor, because I like it, and I didn't just invent this metaphor on the spot, I've used this before, but the idea that you're a little boat in a big ocean, and there's huge waves, and they're pushing you in these random directions, and you're like, I can't control which way the waves are pushing me, but I can paddle, and I paddle,
Yeah.
paddle, and maybe there's all these like islands, there's like these paradise islands that you could get to, and the idea of like, well, the wave just has to push me to them. I have no control. It's like, it's not true. Paddle towards that one. Paddle.
Right.
And like the waves are pushing me away from it. It's like, well, keep paddling. And it's like, there are things that we do when we're talking about self-improvement, when we're talking about wisdom. We're talking about becoming someone who has agency over themselves, someone who is like sovereign over themselves.
Yeah.
It's like that's like this way of like building yourself a sail on your little boat. And it's like, well, now I have more agency. I can actually control better where I'm going.
Right.
It's like, well, now I have a motor on the boat. It's like, wow, you have even more agency. It's like, are you controlling the ocean yet? It's like, no, you never will control the ocean. But can you give yourself more power to get to
Right.
where you need to go? And it's like, well, now I've recruited like an army of like oarsmen, and now they're all
Right.
listening to me as I drum, and I'm like, go, 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 and we're making it to the island.
Right,
And it's like,
getting
it seems like,
more
wow, it's pretty
powerful.
lucky that the wave pushed you to the island. And it's like, well, yes, but also like I made that luck happen. I made the wave get me there eventually because I kept building on myself. I kept finding skills, developing certain circumstances in my life, even just acquiring materials, even just saving up money that allowed me to make it to this place that looks like it was lucky, when in reality it was a combination of luck and decision making.
Yeah, it also certainly like is making me think that when like Poseidon, god of the ocean and sea, is angry and his wrath is coming in this big cyclone and the waves are coming and it's like, oh my god, we're gonna die. It's like you can't control Poseidon, but how are you gonna ride the wave,
Right.
when the flood comes, right? How
Right.
prepared are you? And if you've been working and strengthening and building up your resources and your resiliency,
Right.
and you're strong and you're not weakened,
Yeah.
when the god's wrath comes your way, you can face it. And you can face it and kind of maybe break through the storm and get to the other side. And so that's where that dynamic of just like strengthening oneself comes into play here. It's like, yes, you might face something on the horizon that will just absolutely like destroy you in so many ways, but it will not kill you.
Yeah. I mean, again, this gets, deeper. This conversation could go deeper into cosmic justice. I mean, there's this whole idea of like sin, right?
Yeah.
And like sin is something that we trivialize. We kind of laugh at it and say like, there's no such thing as sin. That's ridiculous. But this old notion is like, there are certain ways that you can live that are virtuous, and there are certain ways that you can live that are sinful, and that you will actually be punished eventually if you sin.
Right.
And the whole idea of like, well, that's silly. There's no God. There's no one watching what I'm doing.
Right.
And it's like, well, look, like think of sin as engaging in certain activity that is going to come back to bite you in the ass.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, is that a real thing?
Right, it's
like,
reality.
of course it's real.
Yeah.
We recognize this. If you walk across the street and every time you do, you don't look both ways,
Yeah.
you could say that you're sinning. And it's like, well, there's no such thing as sin. It's like, well, try it. Try walking across the street without looking both ways every time. Probably you'll be okay. Probably you won't get hit by a car, but one of these days you'll get hit by a car.
Yeah.
And it'll be like, why did that happen? Was it an act of God? It's like, well, it was an act of the universe that comes to slap you in the face when you pretend as if you don't need to take proper action. And so this idea that you can just sort of like twist the fabric of reality, right? You can take the fabric of reality and just pretend that it doesn't exist. I can just go out and do whatever I want. I don't need to follow any rules. I don't need to pretend as if there's any right or wrong way to do anything. It's all relative. In olden times, there used to be a notion of this. It's like, well, that there's sin and there's virtue.
Yeah.
And sin will result in you ending up in hell.
Yeah.
And it might not be in this lifetime, but it might be hell for your children or their children's children.
Right.
And if you don't properly take care of yourself, maybe you're not going to raise your children properly. Maybe you're going to be neglectful towards them. Maybe you're going to be abusive towards them. Maybe you're not going to leave behind any sort of materials for them. And so if you don't pay for it now, your children will pay for it.
Right.
And so this whole idea of hell, it's like, it's kind of real. And anyways, this should be another episode. But
Yes, we'll put that on the list. I think it's just also important to note that like we are gripped in like a social Wheel of Fortune moment with what we are experiencing.
The moment, definitely. And this will be coming out on Sunday the first.
The first.
And so this is definitely a like convergence moment.
Yeah, yeah. I think we feel gripped by many things.
Yeah.
Like this pandemic has been going on for what now? 7 months?
Yeah.
At least 6 months?
Well, we've been definitely affected by it here on the West Coast of
Right.
the United States for 7 months. I think it was.
Yeah. Let that be a collective lesson of something that is by the will of nature that nobody can control,
Yeah.
that comes in and changes the course of so many people's lives,
Yeah.
and really like just like the fabric of like our culture and
Yeah.
society, and like actually like we have to question how we do things, you know, the norms, the economic dynamics,
Yeah.
all of these repercussions that we are dealing with. Is it's like, why is this happening? Why now?
Yeah.
Why on top of everything else that we're dealing with? It's like, Wheel of Fortune, you know?
Right. Right. And with the Wheel of Fortune, with the idea of like the pandemic, it's like, I don't have any control over this. The
Yeah.
pandemic happened. It's like, I had nothing to do with the pandemic happening.
Yeah.
Why me? But at the same time, it's like, well, could it have been prevented? And it's like, in some ways, yes. It's like, were we ready for the pandemic?
Well.
In many ways, we weren't ready. Did certain authorities take proper action
Right,
with the
right,
pandemic? And
right.
so there's this tension of like, so much of this is out of our control, and yet some of it is in our control.
Yeah.
And so that's something we have to sort of grapple with. And it's
Right.
easy for us to decide, well, the people that are responsible for this happening are these people and not anyone else.
Right.
But there's also this notion of like, well, in some ways we're all responsible,
Yeah.
and we need to like maintain that moving into the future. It's easy to think, well, like, well, you know, I have no control over climate change, for instance. And it's like, well, yes and no. It's like you do because you're human.
Yeah.
You're the cause of this in some way, but it's like, can you change it? And it's like, I mean, it kind of gets, I mean, we're about, well, most of us probably already voted, but voting day is coming up, and there is some of this notion with voting where it's like, does your vote count or does it not?
Yeah.
And there is sort of this notion of like, it's both. Like, you're in California, your vote probably doesn't really count. Like, it doesn't really matter if you vote. And yet at the same time, if everyone took that position,
Right. That's the
then
slippery
it wouldn't
slope.
work. And that's the slippery slope. It's like, well,
Yeah.
which one is it? Does my vote count or does it not? It's like,
Right.
it's both.
Yeah.
It's like your vote counts. You need to have agency here. You need to recognize your own power for change, and you need to go out and create that change.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, but like I voted, and like it was so clearly blue that my vote didn't count, obviously.
Right. Yeah.
And it's like, well, okay, so at the same time, there is this sort of feeling that many things are out of your control. You, Alyssa, are not going to decide the election. And yet,
Yeah.
you have some responsibility for the election.
Right. Because
and that's the weird tension.
When you multiply me,
Yeah.
suddenly Alyssa times 1,000,000. Whoa. All the Alyssas out there.
Too much power. Too much genius all at once.
It's you said something earlier about like the ripples. And
Yeah.
we were kind of talking about the ripples of like the universal principle at play. But we as individuals have our ripple effect as well.
Absolutely.
And we set things into motion, things
Yeah.
that we couldn't possibly know. You know, because your attitude towards not taking civic responsibility and not voting, that will ripple out. Whether that ripples to your friends, to your family, to your children, to a general attitude of apathy or nihilism, that means something.
Yeah.
And it's something that we have to contend with as we just orient ourselves to what reality really is, which is the dance between free will and fate, and recognizing our place amongst the greater, really, the cosmos, but also our material reality.
Right. Recognize that at all times, in all things, you have power. And yet, learn to sit with the idea that you are lacking in power. And this is like a famous like Stoic quote, and I don't actually remember who said it, and I'm going to butcher it, but because I didn't prepare for it, but like it's a good way to end the episode, right? This is a good way to end the episode. I'll end it on this quote, but it's like the core of wisdom. I fucked it up. The core of wisdom is understanding what is in your power and what is not. And now it's time for a question from our audience. Here's the question. I am male, but I had a dream about giving birth. It was painful, but beautiful. How do I approach this symbolically?
Well, first and foremost, taking that symbolic lens, birth is about creation and really like the entrance of new life, some sort of new energy that's blossoming into the individual's existence. So I wish I had some more information about this dream because I'm curious.
I know, right? It's a very interesting idea, and it's
Yeah.
a very interesting thing to have a dream about. But there are a lot of questions
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
the imagery here.
Right, right.
What's the experience like?
Like, were they, they might be a male in waking reality, but
Hmm.
did they dream themselves as a male giving birth, or
Hmm.
were they a woman, or was it kind of uncertain?
Yeah,
Because in some ways, like if they were dreaming as themselves, like the dream ego is pretty much like an image of
hmm,
who they are in reality, and they're giving birth. It's like, oh, this is a very interesting dynamic between the masculine and the feminine, as
certainly.
if like the masculine principle within you could kind of tap into and bring to life some form of creation. Or if you were imaging yourself as a woman, maybe it is more about tapping into some more feminine nature, that's going to allow this process to take hold for life to be born.
I mean, it's everyone's dreamscape is different, but it's it does make me wonder. Like, did this person watch the birth happening? Did they see
Like third
themselves as
person or
having a
something.
vagina, and did they see a baby coming out of the vagina? They say the dream was painful in some sense, or it
Yeah.
was like there was the quality of there being pain in the dream.
Right.
It's hard to say
Like
how
a
much
real
you.
birth was actually taking place.
Right, right, like all
Yeah.
the associated pain. But it makes you wonder, is like, were you feeling pain in some sort of vaginal way, or were you feeling it on your penis or something like that? Were you imagining a baby coming out of your penis or something like that? It's like there are questions like this is like really strange and interesting. It's like I wish I knew
Yeah.
more.
Well, one time I dreamt that I was pregnant, and I also dreamt that my brother was pregnant. But he was like,
Right,
he was my brother, like how he
right.
is in real life. It was we won't get into that, but it's an interesting question, right? Because it's like, how was my brother going to give birth?
Hmm.
Like,
Did you think that in the dream?
no, I
No, you
thought
didn't.
it.
You didn't question it.
No, I didn't question. Anyways, I would pose a couple questions to the dreamer, such as like, what do you feel like has been gestating inside of you for
Mhm.
some time? What feels like it's coming alive?
Yeah.
So is there some sort of psychological shifts that have been happening, and maybe now the dream is sort of heralding that like those are taking root? Maybe there's some new venture activity,
Hmm.
some new goals, maybe just a turn towards some sort of development, but just with like the idea of the symbol of birth, that this is not something that just happens on a whim. It's you've been holding it, the woman has been carrying it for 9 months.
Hmm.
It's this laborious process of challenge, yet reward. So whatever is really being born into the dreamer's life is something that I think they could look back on and see has been building for some time.
Yeah. I mean, there's something about giving birth that's not just simply creating. Also, it's right. There's self-sacrifice that's associated with birth.
Oh yeah.
If I mean, in real life, if you give birth, you are potentially sacrificing your body.
Hmm.
Women used to die in
Yeah,
childbirth, so
yeah,
I think
yeah.
there is that sort of inherent symbolism with giving birth. This is like an act of self-sacrifice. This
Yeah.
is an act where you might convert your life into a different life
Mm,
permanently.
mm,
And even if you don't, even if you aren't injured by childbirth and you don't die in childbirth, there's still this notion that this child has changed your life forever.
yeah.
Your life is no longer your own. Your life is now the child's life.
Mm.
And so the act of giving birth is something that's much more cosmic and all-encompassing and really communicates a deep, deep change of like your life becoming something it never was before. That would be different as opposed, than just like creating like a painting where it's
Right.
like, that's done, put it on
Yeah.
the wall, that's
Yeah.
it. It's like, no, this is something much deeper and more complex than that.
Yes. I'm kind of thinking like what might the role of the archetype of the mother play for this dreamer?
Mhm.
How might that be something that they can draw upon at this time? Because certainly there's the implications, as you're saying, that like there's sacrifice, that there's like a shifting of identity
Yeah.
in the role that you play and what you give up. But that's part of the process of transformation
Mhm.
for any parent as they leave behind youth, and they step into something that gives life new meaning. So, in what ways might being the role of like both the mother and the father possibly like be,
Yeah.
what's lying under the surface here symbolically?
Mhm.
Look at the archetype of the father, look at the archetype of the mother, see if there's something within that might be striking you as resonant.
Yeah. It just seems really heavy
Yeah.
And I mean,
Yeah.
again, I want more details.
Yeah.
I want to know. I mean, I want to know how it felt like after you woke up. Like,
Yeah,
was this a
certainly.
very, very emotional experience? Did this create any sort of real life change? Did you come to some conclusion after this dream of like, oh, I'm going to do something different now than I was before?
Yeah.
Because that's what I would imagine. And he said that it was sort of a beautiful experience, which makes me think that this is viewed as some sort of positive growth dream, some sort of path of individuation, some sort of way of taking everything that belongs and bringing it together and sort of converging it into like this rebirth.
Yeah.
Like, death and rebirth as like this like transformation that happens. And
Yeah, the child might be him.
yeah, that'd be interesting if he saw his own face, if he gave birth to himself.
That's not what I mean. I mean,
Wouldn't that be a crazy dream though?
it's like I'm the doctor and I'm the mom giving birth and I'm the
Right.
baby.
Right.
It's not what I meant. I
It's like,
meant
Joe, what will you name your baby? It's like, I will name him Joe. And then the baby like turns around and is like, hello, Joe. And you say back, hi, Joe. And it's like, whoa, this is getting pretty weird. And it's like, oh, my whole family is here. And like your grandparents are there and all your brothers and sisters and they all have your face. And like they're all Joe. It's like, whoa, what's happening? This is a very, it seems kind of Freudian almost. I'm not sure how to analyze that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I derailed the
You so
conversation.
derailed it. No, it was really funny. Maybe that's what happened. But what I meant was when we take that subjective viewpoint with dream analysis and we look at all the different figures and themes as representing parts of our self, if there's an actual child that's being born in the dream, or even just the implication. And it's because when you said rebirth, and it's like, yeah, this is a birth, but it could be a rebirth of some part of the individual that is emerging. And maybe it has a lot to do with like the inner child too. Maybe there's like a new relationship that's forming with some aspect of that childlike innocent quality of the dreamer, something that they can nurse now, something that maybe wasn't held and cared for as much as it could have been. Sometimes I think a lot of process of inner work and development is reparenting ourselves and kind
totally.
of becoming our own kind of vessel of healing and support, while also finding forgiveness and compassion for the past.
So I would ask the dreamer, is there anything that's happened in your life that you need to actually commit to and say, this is my life from now on? Is there something that's being created in your life that maybe you aren't fully embracing and maybe you should really embrace it? Maybe it's time to let part of yourself die that you haven't let go of yet because maybe part of you is anticipating a transition into parent mode. And that doesn't just mean literally having children. It means becoming a parent to the world or giving something to the world that is self-sacrificial. And is there some cause, is there some path that you see as being greater that maybe isn't going to lead to like pleasure and comfort, but is something more meaningful and powerful for that? Do you feel that? And are you not embracing it for some reason? And maybe it's time to embrace it. Do you have a question for us? Do you have a dream you'd like us to analyze? Is there a topic you'd like us to cover?
We want to hear from you. Contact us through the submission form, which can be found at our Instagram page at Golden Shadow Podcast. Or if you're listening on YouTube, you can find the link in the description down below.
Thanks for listening.
See you later.
If you find this podcast useful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Golden Shadow Podcast. Thank you.